Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kocman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE, joined by Scott Dunford, West Coast Mobilizer for ABWE, and Lead Church Planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. Scott, our listeners and viewers don't know this. This is like our third take on the introduction here, and I think we need shorter job titles. I think that's what would help us. I think what would also help us is if we had maybe a little bit higher budget of a recording studio in my basement. Of course, I'm coming to you from the basement if you're tuning in by video. And Scott, you look like you're coming to us from a very well-lit bedroom on the West Coast where it's still light out right now.
It's still light and it's hot. So Neil, our guest, would understand this because he had lived in Northern California. Like, we never get thunderstorms and it's never humid here. And last week, or on Sunday, we woke up to for this Midwesterner, the best thunderstorm I've seen in a long time. And yet we have humidity in the air. People are kind of freaking out. It's 100 degrees. What are we going to do? And so if I'm a little sweaty, it's because we don't have air conditioning because we never need it, but it's hot today. And so yes, I'm here. I'm not in Kanye's studio like last week. At least that's what we told everybody. I'm here in my own home and excited to dive into this discussion today.
I thought you were just sweaty because you were so worried about, going on the air and making sure that you put on a good impression for everybody. Yeah, not at all. Well,
it's my Nixon sweat.
Well, you're not a crook, and we're glad you're joining us, Scott, but we're also really grateful for our current guest here. The reason we're doing video is because we want to be able to read each other's faces. We want to be able to engage each other face to face as best we can, because we're about to address an important topic. And unless you've been living under a rock for the last few years, there's been a little bit of a kerfuffle in evangelicalism over issues relating to social justice, or so I hear. Not that I would know firsthand. Certainly neither one of us have ever talked to each other about those sorts of things. And when we do, we always see perfectly eye to eye all the time.
I like and agree and retweet all of your tweets. And I know that you're doing the same thing for mine.
Always. I especially do retweet all of them without exception. Well,
yes.
And if you are active in the Twitter sphere, or even if you're not, maybe you've heard of our next guest by the name of Neil Shenvi. And Neil is a Christian, a dad, a homeschooler, a theoretical chemist, which theoretically makes him a lot smarter than I am, and also a blogger and a writer online. Neil, I don't want to steal your thunder. Please introduce yourself. And honestly, what makes you the person with your background and that resume, which impressive as it is, what made you start writing on this issue? Heck, why should we listen to somebody with your resume too on some of these things? So introduce us to yourself for those of us who haven't heard of you.
Sure. Well, you hit the main topics. I have a PhD in theoretical chemistry. I quit my job at Duke, I think 7 years ago now, to homeschool my 4 kids. They're entering 6th, 4th, 2nd grade in kindergarten tomorrow. And why am I qualified to talk about critical theory? And I guess the short answer is that I'm not technically qualified. I don't have formal training in this field, but providentially, God led me into this area about 2 or 3 years ago through meeting my friend, Dr. Pat Sawyer, who is a professor at UNCG and was getting his PhD and doing his dissertation on critical theory. So he has a PhD in education and cultural studies. And our paths crossed. I was interested in apologetics. Ever since I became a Christian, I wanted to help atheists and non-Christians see why Christianity was true. But then a few years ago, I noticed this drift within evangelicalism that I couldn't figure out. And it seemed to do with social justice and justice issues and race and gender and sexuality. But I couldn't figure out how you connect a desire for justice, which I think is a good thing, when you define it biblically. How do you connect that idea to all of these other very heterodox ideas I was seeing coming out of otherwise conservative evangelicals? And then when I met Pat a few years ago, I began to connect the dots. And so I began reading voraciously. And that's how I got interested in this subject.
So I'd like you to just maybe expound on that a little bit. So when you say, hey, these are orthodox evangelicals, but these heterodox views, what do you mean by heterodox views?
Yeah, well, the extreme ones would have to do with, let's start with the idea of where they were coming from. I was seeing this this drift taking place among people that are evangelical, meaning they would affirm the authority of Scripture, the inerrancy of Scripture. They would affirm the exclusivity of Christ. And all of those things were things they affirmed, at least they did, say, 10 years ago. But I was seeing this drift where they begin to shift in terms of how they viewed, say, sexuality, gender, whether they were accepting of LGBTQ identities, then what they viewed about gender roles, and then things like even whether they thought that Christianity, that Jesus was the exclusive way to God even. So, and then sometimes they even became atheists but they were moving progressively towards the left end of the political spectrum. So I thought, they're just drifting politically. But as I began to read in this area of critical social theory, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, these areas, I began to see that something deeper was going on. They were really adopting a new worldview. And it was not that their politics was shifting, it was that their theology was shifting, and that was driving their political shift.
So before we go too far, let's just define some terms for our listeners as well as for our discussion. So, clearly, as Alex has pointed out, there's a lot going on in the discussion on social justice. So some are using that term just meaning, hey, like we just want to see justice reign. Others are using the term maybe a little differently. And then it's also used pejoratively, like you're a social justice warrior, So clearly we've seen this discussion blow up on certain aspects, at least of evangelicalism, and certainly within our little tribes that we're part of. So back that up for us. What is this idea of critical theory, critical race theory? What is intersectionality? Can you define some of those things for us and help us to understand what we're dealing with here?
Sure, that's great. You're a man after my own heart. I love defining terms, and a large part of this discussion and debate circles around terms that are never defined. That's part of the reason they get so much purchase, because they're just buzzwords. They're positive, they're encomiums, they're things that you hear and you have this visceral reaction to. So social justice is very polarizing. And I like to point out that it has a broad range of definitions. So for example, if you look at the ESV, the section heading, I think it's Exodus 23, but it says laws of social justice. Yeah, the ESV translators, they're not, and it's actually,
Alex, I was right.
But the point is, that's probably like 15 years ago. They're not using that term in any progressive sense at all. They're saying keeping the laws God gave to order society under the Mosaic covenant, and they term them laws of social justice. Because all they're thinking is, they're laws about justice, because God gave them, and they're about how we apply them to society. So social justice. And there's an essay in the ESV also that talks about social justice just defined as applying biblical principles to our laws. And I think all Christians rightly are in favor of applying biblical principles to our laws. So obviously when they hear social justice, if they're defining it that way, then it's something everyone should accept. And the term goes back actually to a 19th century Italian priest. So he coined that term. And so there's a long tradition of the Catholic Church thinking of social justice as biblical principles applied to how our laws and our society should function. Okay, that's one end of the spectrum. It's an idea that's at least grounded in a Christian worldview. However, in popular culture today, that's not what the term social justice means, I would say, at all. They're not thinking about biblical principles. If you look in the social justice literature, people writing what's called critical social justice, they will define social justice as the elimination of all forms of social oppression, where oppression is being defined in terms of something called critical theory. That's next term we have to define. What's critical theory then? If you're defining social justice in this other sense as destroying all oppression, where oppression is being defined by critical theory, what's critical theory? Okay. So now let's go back. We have to go back to Karl Marx, because according to Bradley Levinson in his book Beyond Critique, Karl Marx stands out as the source he's the first true critical theorist. Now, later critical theorists adopted Marx's views not about economics per se and class per se. They were mainly interested in applying Marx's analysis of how power operated within society to create social inequality, to create social stratification. And so the term critical theory was coined by the Frankfurt School in the 1920s and 30s. These were guys that were trying to apply Marx's ideas about power to things like culture and mass media and ideology. So you have figures like Horkheimer, Marcuse, Adorno, independently of figures like Antonio Gramsci. They were all applying Marx's ideas more broadly than just economics, right? So that's where the critical theory was coined by the Frankfurt School. But since then, the field's grown even more. So today, critical theory would encompass a wide variety of disciplines known as critical social theories, which include things like critical race theory, critical pedagogy, queer theory, and things like post-colonialism, which is probably most relevant to what you're doing in your missions work.
Yeah. And we want to define those. Before we get into ways in which you think that this has filtered into the evangelical mindset, there's probably another buzz term that we should define for our audience's sake, which would be intersectionality.
Sure. So intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in her paper Mapping the Margins. Now, she was a critical race theorist, and they were scholars looking to understand how the law actually works to justify the power of the ruling class, in this case, white. So how does the law actually function to preserve white social dominance? That's critical race theory. But she coined the phrase intersectionality to explain how, say, the experience of a Black woman could not be reduced to the experience of a Black person or a woman. So she's pointing out that our identities are multiply centered. There's more than just being a man and being white and being a woman and being Black, or being a woman and being Hispanic, or being disabled and being poor. All of those identities intersect in ways that give you a unique experience. And her point was that you can be discriminated against not just as a Black person or just as a woman, but as a Black woman. And that's where the idea came from. Now, again, you could understand that idea of intersectionality narrowly to just mean, okay, our identities are complicated, and well, duh. I mean,
right.
Who denies that? That's sort of obvious. Or you can use that term broadly, in which case it's basically synonymous with critical theory. And you're saying that we're oppressed in various ways. And that would tie into how critical theory understands oppression.
So how do you think that this has impacted evangelicalism?
Okay, so it's definitely impacting the broader culture. There's no question. There are actually some really funny graphs of word usage at, say, the New York Times. And you can plot like the New York Times usage of the word white privilege. And you see in 2010, it just sort of starts spiking. I mean, it's up like a factor of 10 from what it was in 2010. Even though the word itself is like 30 years old, the phrase itself. Intersectionality, it's the same spike in 2010. White fragility, it's a spike in 15 or something. So these terms have just been mainstreamed really rapidly. Now, for better or worse, evangelicals are part of the culture. I'm an evangelical. We're part of the culture. And so we tend to just pick up these fads and try to Christianize them. Again, for better or worse.
That doesn't sound like something that we as evangelicals would do.
It's probably a hot take. No, I think it's pretty typical, right, of what we do. I think it's bad because it's reactive. We're not giving the culture a vision of biblical justice. We're trying to take the culture's idea of biblical justice and then baptize it. Or sorry, taking the culture's idea of justice and baptizing it. So I think that's in general is a bad thing. I agree that we should try to speak the language of the culture in the sense of being able to communicate effectively to them. But we shouldn't absorb their ideas, especially not critically. So I think what we've seen in the last 5 or 10 years is that we've absorbed these ideas very uncritically. And oftentimes, I think you can see that there's what's called, what Brett Weinstein calls idea laundering. So a lot of evangelicals won't cite critical race theorists directly. They'll cite other Christians. then if you read those other Christians, they'll cite other Christians, and those other Christians will be citing the actual critical race theorists. The problem is then if you ask that first author, well, where'd you get your ideas? They're like, from Christians, right? Because they haven't traced the citations back to these ideas are actually coming from people like Robin DiAngelo, Eduardo Benitez Silva, and other very prominent secular critical race theorists. So I think that by now we're beyond the point where evangelicals are appealing directly to the sources. They're now appealing to these second or third order citations that will often disguise where these ideas are actually coming from. And by the way, I'm not making a genetic fallacy argument here. I'm not saying because the ideas come from secular sources, they're false, right? All truth is God's truth. Some truth can be discovered by secular scholars. And if it's true, it's true. I don't care if they're Christian or non-Christians. And yet I'm arguing these ideas are actually false and they're rooted in a false worldview. And yet we're absorbing them uncritically. That's the problem.
Before I have a question, but before we do that, can you help me understand? You keep saying we do this and we do that. Like, who's this we that we're doing? Because I would go like, no, I'm not doing that. Like, I might use some of the language that you're referring to, but like for instance, like we just talked about social justice being a word that Christians have used for a long time.
Yeah,
and it seems like you're saying, well, Christians are only using social justice because because of critical race theory. So what do you mean by we and who's doing this?
Sorry, I should be careful. So I'm speaking we, not the regal we. It's not the real we because I'm not doing this. I mean, it's pretty clear from my writing that I am opposed to this ideology. And again, I'm not opposed to biblical justice, obviously, but I would want to make it very clear that we have to distinguish between these biblical ideas that sound similar and then these non-biblical or anti-biblical ideas that are, I think, influencing Christian thought. So when I say, I can say, I don't want to be harsh and say those guys, but I can give some examples of, again, some prominent evangelicals who are using this language and absorbing these ideas. And I would say in a very dangerous and uncritical way. And if you know my work at all, I don't name names. I'm careful to pick out the ideas because I think many times these individuals don't really, I don't want to say understand. They use these terms and these ideas without thinking carefully through them. And we're very polarized right now. So what happens is you have the justice-minded Christians and you have anti-woke Christians. And you're either on the good team or the bad team, depending on which team you think is the good team and bad team. Yeah. And you tend not to listen carefully to what the other side's actually saying.
Yeah. And just to be frank, like that was one of my frustrations with your writing is that so-and-so is saying this, but I can't see who so-and-so is. So I can't see the context and I don't even know if they're relevant, that's just my opinion, but kind of digging down to that, I want to let you respond and think through that. But so there's a long tradition of Christians, sometimes it's talked about as like we're plundering the Egyptians, which obviously it's not a phrase we necessarily are using for this, but that is the idea. Like, and especially when it comes to observations, like Christians have always done that. Even the term logos, is a term that's taken and it was used by Greek philosophers, and we're using that because we understand, hey, there's something there. And then with Christianity, we talk about all sorts of ideas that we don't agree with. We don't agree with the concept behind ego, but we use it frequently. Mm-hmm. And especially some of these terms where we say, hey, there's an observation here that's right. Like as you're talking about, intersectionality, for instance, I can say, I can bet that it's, that it's harder to be a Black woman than it is to be a white man, and that there are compounding factors. It's harder to be a Black woman that doesn't speak English in America. We can make sense of that and go like, I get that. But yet you're kind of pushing that and saying Christians shouldn't be using this kind of language. How do you, I'm not saying you're trying to reconcile these things, but how do you take this long Christian tradition of saying, hey, there's these cultural ideas. We can learn some stuff from Marx. Like I'm saying that, like Marx made some observations about power that sometimes hold true. Let's look at that without embracing all of Marx's thinking. Are you saying we can't learn from these Christians, or how do you want to nuance that?
So what I would say is I recommend that Christians, if they want to take the actually true ideas from these non-Christian thinkers, that's fine if they're actually true. And if they're actually true, then they've been discovered through, again, observation of God's general revelation in nature, right? So God reveals his truth through nature, through reality, and even non-Christians can observe reality and come to recognize truth. And we can obviously affirm that those things are true because they're grounded in God's revelation. Okay, but then if you want to do that, so obviously if you find something that's true in Crenshaw or in Marx that's actually true, then it's not grounded in Marx or in Crenshaw, it's grounded in God's revelation, then by all means affirm that actual truth. But what I would just say is don't use the jargon. Why? And here, the example I always use is this. Imagine I said, I want to affirm the truth of reproductive justice. We need to work for reproductive justice for all people. And you say, wait. You want to affirm what now? I say, well, I define reproductive justice to mean the right of women to have or not have children if they should choose to, right? The government shouldn't force them to be sterile. They shouldn't you say, are you for that? Well, of course I'm for that. Well, then what's the problem? Well, have you ever Googled the phrase reproductive justice? Because that phrase means something quite different to the vast majority of people. You're defining that phrase in a very unusual way. So I would say the same thing is true of, say, intersectionality, the phrase, or the phrase white fragility, or the phrase white privilege. If you actually look at the scholars who defined those terms, they would understand them in very different ways than you might. And to make yourself clear then, why should we be wedded to a term that will produce confusion at best and at worst will mislead people? So for example, if I told someone I am fully supportive of reproductive justice, they would at best be confused because they're like, well, wait a minute, you're against abortion. I'm like, oh, of course I am. Or they'd be misled and think, wow, what a progressive Christian, right, who's for abortion, and would walk away thinking that. So I just aim for clarity. If I find truth there is truth there are true insights you can find in the writings of critical race theorists. But all I have to do then is just turn that truth and put it in plain language, and Christians will say, yeah, of course. And like you said, and obviously the experiences of a poor black homeless woman are going to be different than the experiences of a rich white, educated man. Like everyone's like, well, duh. Well, okay, but it's true. And so we can affirm that without using the jargon, which is linked to this very, I would say, dangerous ideology.
So is your concern more with the Christians' use of jargon, or is it with the ideas that actually you believe Christians are actually holding?
I think it's the idea. That's why. So if all Christians across evangelicalism, it's as if we're united on anything, but if they were, in theory, using these phrases, defining them clearly, very clearly, and precisely, and explaining exactly why the ideology and ideas are very bad and dangerous. And then using these phrases in a very specific way, I'd still like, well, why use the phrases? But at least I'd be happier. I'd be more comfortable. What I'm seeing is exactly the opposite. I'm seeing them not defining terms at all. I'm seeing them using these ideas, and that ideas are working their way through their thinking without any reflection as to whether or not they should be. They say, well, we're going to eat the meat and spit out the bones. And I say the better analogy is trying to eat the meat and spit out the poison, because these ideas they're just saturated with this wrong way of thinking. Or an analogy I've used too is with critical race theory, say, are there true insights of critical race theory? Have any true insights? And I'd say, yeah, I've read tons of critical race theory. There's some truth in there. Otherwise, people don't believe pure lies. It's very rare. And yet, I would say we should be as cautious with critical race theory as we are with queer theory. Are there literally no truths whatsoever found in queer theory? I mean, they're not literally none. Or say in the Book of Mormon, are there no truths at all? I mean, no, they believe God exists, right? But would you ever recommend people, oh yeah, by all means, read the Book of Mormon for its spiritual insight, or read queer theorists to understand gender properly? Not in a billion years. So that's the danger I would see in wanting to just, affirm the truth that's in there without really highlighting the dangers associated with these ideas.
One of the helpful things that you do in your work, in my opinion, is point us to original sources. I think that's something that we all need to do. We all need to rely less on blogs, less on Twitter, less on podcasts, more on the people in their own words. And so you make reference to, some of the dangers of what you feel are critical theory. Myself and some research that I was doing, I was reading one of the more mild sources, which would be Critical Race Theory. I think it was the second edition by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik. One of the things that they say on page 104 when they're talking about objections to critical race theory that they would anticipate, they put, finally, CRT's adversaries are perhaps most concerned with what they perceive to be critical race theorists' nonchalance about objective truth. They say this: for the critical race theorist, objective truth, like merit, does not exist, at least in social science and politics. In these realms, truth is a social construct created to suit the purposes of the dominant group. So, again, I think we're getting at something which is helpful, maybe interesting, which is that there's bones and there's meat, or there's poison and there's meat. There's maybe some helpful insights, but there's a lot of severe baggage at the very least that can't be ignored. So, in your opinion, if we were to follow through the logic of critical theory to its furthest logical extent, what do you think that would do to missions and evangelism in particular?
Yeah. And also, Scott, just one more thing to your point, Scott, I don't name names and if you force me to, I will, but I don't do it in talks like this.
I'm going to try.
I'm speaking broadly about the ideas, right? I want to attack the ideas.
And here's why. Yeah. Because I'm not to interrupt you. Well, yeah, I do want to interrupt you. Because I've got friends who've been attacked, like Matt Hall has been gone after hard. Well, I know Matt, he loves Jesus. He loves the word. He's faithful. I mean, the guy isn't espousing these ideas, I could name others, that I know, and yet they're attacked. I'm not saying you're attacking them. I mean, your pastor's been attacked on these issues. So by not naming names, it leaves people to go what's going on? Are these guys reading these books, and are they trying to sneak these ideas into the church? And it's that's where I think it gets so heated, is because it's not that people are necessarily referring to the original sources. It's they're going after the pastors who may be using language that is connected to this intentionally or not.
Well, that's the thing. So I remember Matt had a video, we came out, and he was clearly, undeniably using critical race theory terminology in the ways that critical race theory prescribes it. He was talking about white supremacy in the way that critical theory defines white supremacy. There's no question. Now, he actually came out later. Tom Askell emailed him and said, "Do you believe this?" He said, "No, I reject critical race theory." So, he didn't explain why he was using the terms, but that's my point. If he dropped the jargon totally and just said what he believed to be true, then there wouldn't be, he either would have said what's true or he would have actually said what's false. But the point is, there wouldn't be this question. So I think it would be solved if he just dropped the jargon and just said things like, I think whites, because we're in the majority, we tend to assume our culture is the default, and that's wrong. If he'd said that, we should obviously, there's no default culture. There are many cultures. They all have good and bad parts of them. But he'd said that and not use the phrase white supremacy or whiteness, then people would not be presumably jumping on him quite so much. And so I think that's a simple solution. But
even phrases like white supremacy go way farther back than critical race theory. And so we have to, and we do recognize there are real problems, especially in Southern Christian culture. And to be able to call those out and have some language to call it out, or at least cause people to think through some things. Don't you think we need to do that? Isn't that part of our role as Christian leaders?
Right. But again, the way he was using the term, it was so white supremacy within, white supremacy in critical race theory. It just means whiteness as the norm. So white culture, white thinking, those are assumed as the default. It does not mean white supremacy as, say, the dictionary defines it, which is a state of rule and superiority by whites like the Klan, or, that they would want. Doesn't mean what the dictionary says. It means what critical race theory thinks. And here's the problem. The Smithsonian a few weeks ago had an infographic claiming that objective rational thinking was an element of white culture and whiteness. And you're like,
objective rational thinking, Judeo-Christian religion, nuclear family, all these things are sort of being tagged with whiteness.
And you're like, I would expect to see that on like a neo-Nazi manifesto, but I would not expect the Smithsonian Museum of African American History to claim that rational thinking is whiteness. So the point is, and you'd obviously look it up in the dictionary, whiteness does not refer to what they think it refers to. They're redefining their terms within the framework of critical race theory. But my only point is, if Matt had wanted to make a statement that was true, he could have dropped all of that jargon. And he could have said things like, white Southern culture has bad elements that are legacies of racist ways of thinking that we need to reflect on as Christians and think about and put to death any racist sentiments. Now, if he'd said that when he talked about latent white supremacy or whatever you want to talk about, I don't think people would have gotten as upset, right? But when he uses this terminology in that way, they are rightly thinking he's invoking a different concept that has a lot of problems buried in it. So, for example, like you said, the Smithsonian, when you start dismissing rational thinking as an attribute of whiteness, what's that going to do to the way you think about, like Alex just said, missions, the gospel, evangelism? When you start thinking that Judeo-Christianity or morality is somehow tied to white culture rather than being tied to God's law, and you start saying we have to dismantle white supremacy, meaning whiteness is the norm, meaning Judeo-Christian norms, that's a problem. And you can see it in organizations like Black Lives Matter that will say overtly, we want to work to dismantle heteronormative thinking. We want to, decenter the nuclear family, which is a Western patriarchal construct. So things like that, they're all tied together in the minds of critical theorists, and we have to be very careful not to endorse that way of thinking.
It's one thing that you're saying that, you made a good point just now. So they're tied together in the heads of those who hold to critical theory.
Yeah.
So we would not have a difficult time reflecting on biblically why racism, even racism that's deeply embedded into the assumptions and certain subcultures in the U.S., perhaps in the U.S. South, in some pockets, some significant areas, we have no problem seeing why that's wrong. And when we see people saying with the power critique, right, pointing out that people who have power tend to want to hold on to that power, tend to exploit things, even things like propositional truth. Anything can be used by a sinful, totally depraved person in the service of their sin. We have no problem with that insight. One of the reasons it sounds like that you're drawing out that using the jargon of those theories themselves is unhelpful for highlighting that particular biblically non-controversial insight is because for the critical theorist, those things are all necessarily related. See, we want to necessarily say that's an issue over here, but we would also say, well, but biblical sexuality is biblical sexuality, and there's probably several other issues there that we would say are just straightforward biblically. But for the person holding to an intersectionality framework, anything that can be characterized as hegemonic is bad. So anything that occupies a cultural hegemony is bad, which would include heteronormativity, as you mentioned.
Scott, let me give you an example just to show what I'm talking about. Take the phrase anti-racist. There are churches pushing to be anti-racist. So you say, well, and to be obviously clear, Christians should be utterly opposed to racism. Obviously, right? So that's not, but here's the thing. So people hear that term, they're like, well, racist, anti-racist, I guess anti-racist means being opposed to racism. That is absolutely not how critical theorists use that term or how it's being used in our culture today. So when people throw around that term without defining it, without explaining how it's being used, they're setting other Christians up for some really bad thinking. I'm going to quote from Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It was the #2 bestseller on Amazon for several weeks in June, behind Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. And in that book, he explains what anti-racism means. And he says things like this. Anti-racist policies cannot eliminate class racism without anti-capitalism policies. Anti-capitalism cannot eliminate class racism without anti-racism. To be anti-racist is to be feminist. To be feminist is to be anti-racist. We cannot be anti-racist if we are homophobic or transphobic. To be queer anti-racist is to understand the privileges of my cisgender, of my masculinity, of my heterosexuality, of their intersections. So that this is I would say the most popular author right now on anti-racism, telling you flat out, if you don't see this ideology in terms of a full-blown critical theory lens, you're doing it wrong. You cannot be an anti-racist if you're holding on. Imagine going to Kendi and say, I would like to be an anti-racist, but I'm still going to have male eldership in my church and be opposed to homosexuality and transgenderism as immoral things. He would just laugh at your face. He'd be like, you are not remotely an anti-racist.
Well, sure.
My only point is,
Yeah, sure. But, so what? I mean, Kendi doesn't get to decide the rules of the game. And Christians always use analogies. I just heard recently, to kind of flip it on another, like John MacArthur, who's like obviously in the news all the time right now with his his stand on church and social distancing and masking and all that. Well, he got up and said, we are practicing civil disobedience. Well, there's a context of that term. And he knew the context because it was, he had used it before, and Phil Johnson had tweeted before, about the stuff that was going on with Black Lives Matter. And so clearly he's using a term, but there was no one listening that thought, oh man, John MacArthur, they're probably going to go out in the streets now and start, he was using the term in a way that everyone by context could understand what he meant.
Sure.
And it wasn't, we can trace the term back, but, where does that end? Like even the term white, if we say white to each other, like, hey, or just a couple white guys talking to Neil, does that, we don't go like, oh, it goes all the way back to this Portuguese priest, back that used white as a distinction from black and who could be slaves and who couldn't be slaves. We're not doing that. We have a context in which we understand how the language is working. Do we really need to go back and go like, well, this guy who wrote this book that some people are reading, but most people have no idea who he is. He's the one who gets to determine how we use the word.
Well, I think the key is one, I always say, just Google it, because you'll see what's the colloquial usage, right? And two, I would say, if I were confident, if I got up on in the pulpit, I'm not a pastor, even an officer of the church, but if I got up in the pulpit and I said, let me explain to you exactly why critical theory is deeply, fundamentally anti-biblical. I explained all of it. And I said, now here's how these critical theorists use the term anti-racist. And I explained exactly how they use it. I said, I refuse to use that term this way, but I'm going to use that term to mean this. If I took 30 minutes and did all of that, I would have zero problem using the term. None, right? But what I hear is literally someone tweets out, hashtag anti-racist church. And then you have literally a million Christians who see that tweet and think, oh, anti-racism equals good. And for worse, to our shame, I think Christians are so used to just not thinking carefully. We live in this, soundbite culture. Our discernment basically is equivalent to saying, 2 legs bad and 4 legs good. We don't have this careful.
Yes.
Well, what do they mean by that? How are they defining that term? We just hear this, snappy a jingle on K-Love. We hear a soundbite. We see a good tweet. We give it a thumbs up. We share it, but we're not parsing these terms at all. And that's why I'd say, look, if you really want to explain how racism can be embedded in culture, just explain that. Take an extra 5 minutes and do that. But using these terms, like using the term reproductive justice or using the term, some other queer.
Well, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Even the word justice is slippery because are we referring to equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? Yeah. Right. So all these terms can be slippery, but I think if we were to apply a doctrine of Christian liberty to this, if we were to say, and I don't personally hold this, but if we were to say These terms are completely neutral. They're completely redeemable. Let's freely reappropriate them, right? Let's plunder the Egyptians and redeem this terminology, right? And put it under the feet of Jesus. If we were to take that approach with terms like social justice and the related lingo, jargon that comes with it, we would still be accountable to our weaker brothers.
Yeah.
And we would still be accountable not to violate their consciences and, through association with idols, as Paul would say, defile their consciences. And in much the same way, even with the best of intentions, as we start to appropriate language that to many in the world, if you Google and if you think, all right, what is the vernacular, in this term, what is the colloquial usage? If the colloquial usage is pagan, we ought to at least have a check in our spirits about using some of those things. But I do want to make some application to mission. Yeah. Because even though we have disagreements on this issue, what makes this conversation important on this particular special episode is that we do all agree, and we've talked about this at length, that there is a proxy war against Christianity in the name of everything that is quote unquote Western and associated with that. And the West has lots of foibles, lots of baggage. But we saw just a few short weeks ago how a good friend of ours, a good friend of Scott and myself, friend of the show, was eviscerated on Twitter for his engaging in evangelism among frontier unreached people groups. Sure. Because of the idea of you're a white American colonialist coming in and imposing your religion on these innocent indigenous population and corrupting their way of life, all those sorts of things. We may disagree with certain applications of what we're talking about here, but when it gets out there, certainly things become very clear that however far we go in what we do or don't take from critical theory, we don't go that far with it, right? And so one of the things that you mentioned earlier in the podcast was post-colonial theory. Yeah. Can you describe to us what that is? And maybe we'll get into how that plays into missions.
And let me say something before you jump into that, because I think we would recognize that there's things with colonialism that we all go, right. Every missionary sees it. I saw it. I had to deal with those things in Asia because there was colonialists that were in there and created a mentality of what Christianity was that we had to break down and refocus. I don't want to say deconstruct, but we had to help them.
Why don't you want to say deconstruct, Scott? Just use that term. Plunder the term deconstruction.
I would use it, but I got two weaker brothers and I don't want to get you guys offended. So how would we have to deal with that, and we recognize, I've even had friends that grew up in Africa and talked about just the latent racism that they had seeing, here's who we are in the compound and those brown-skinned, dirty people that we have to deal with, even though they're missionaries. And later on, they came whoa, what were we thinking? So, we're not talking about the fact that, colonialism was great, but we see the errors of it.
You don't want to make colonialism great again.
Right.
No, that's right. And that's where I'm saying that again, but that's the thing, Scott, you could take those truths and every missiologist in the hopefully in the world would say, well, of course we want to reflect on what is the gospel and what is our cultural, imposition on the gospel. What
we
God
made
reveals.
Mistakes. How do we do it right?
We made mistakes. Yeah. And, and so I think there's no Christian, hopefully, who would not think carefully about what is my culture and what is the actual God's revelation, what is universal and what is particular. So that's the thing that missiologists talk about all the time. So you don't have to import the post-colonialist social critical theory framework to that discussion at all. It's completely about, that's good biblical thinking. But the lens, so basically post-colonialism really more or less starts with Frantz Fanon, who is where was he born? He was born in in Martinique maybe, and was very involved in the Algerian independence struggle. And he basically, I think largely from Marx, saw the colonial indigenous struggle in terms of, again, oppressor, oppressed, say it's the same framework. And he was a psychoanalyst, so he brought a lot of Freudian psychoanalysis to this picture. But he said that colonialism is about more than just military power. It's about the ideas of the colonizer being imposed on the colonial society and infecting both the colonizer and the colonized, so they have internalized these ideas. So it's completely consistent with Gramsci and even Marx. So that then that framework then gets brought through people like Edward Said and I guess Spivak and a number of other post-colonial scholars. So that nowadays it basically is very similar to the critical social theory, but it's applied not to a culture like the U.S. It's applied to colonial, post-colonial relationships. But they would still see there's this hegemonic discourse, this discourse the colonizer imposes on the colonized people that infects their ways of thinking. They have to be freed from that way of thinking to recover their pre-colonial or indigenous ways of knowing, their epistemologies, their moral framework. And they would see the primary sin, if you will, as what they call cultural imperialism, where you're imposing your ideas on this other culture. Now, you immediately see the problem we run into as Christians doing missions work, because in their minds, we are literally, if we go to an unreached people group, we are colonizers. Even if we go there with, we adopt their style of dress, we adopt their food, we adopt their way, everything that we can that's biblically permissible. But if we come in there and say, and yet here's the true religion, you need to abandon your old religion and follow Jesus, and you have to now begin testing all of your practices and your values against God's revelation, that would be completely wicked in their eyes. And I can give you examples of them just saying that flat out, saying like,
oh yeah,
Christian missions is oppressive. Yeah.
And that's important, because it's not just saying that it becomes oppression once you start enslaving the native population or changing their style of dress or their music. In this thinking, it's oppression the moment you start saying, just the moment you start proselytizing, even if you want to change nothing else about the culture itself.
Yeah. So here's a quote from Adams teaching for diversity and social justice. She talks about the term white privilege you've heard. She talks about Christian privilege, and that's, if you look at the figures, they have figures where they have different oppressor groups and different oppressed groups, and Christian is the oppressor group in the U.S., along with whites and men and heterosexuals, and the oppressed groups are non-Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and so that's very. So if you say we want to dismantle all systems of privilege, well, they would say then dismantle Christianity, because it's a system of privilege. It privileges Christianity and their norms and their values and their practices over other religions. And in that book, Adams says things like proselytizing shades into religious oppression when the person being proselytized experiences it as an act of harassment and as an assault on the legitimacy of their own religion. Think about what you just said. It's not when they're abused. This is talking about actually the U.S. context. But
right. It's how you feel.
It's how you feel. And if you're saying their religion is not legitimate, that is oppression. But what are we doing when we're going to non-Christian peoples and saying, here's the gospel, if not calling into question the legitimacy of their religion? That's just what we're doing. And we can't, if we think Christianity is true, we can't apologize for that. I mean, we can be again, I'm not talking about enslaving them, abusing them. I'm talking about just saying Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. That itself would be perceived as oppressive.
Now, here's a question as well. There's a friend of the program. I won't name him because there's been so many names named that I'm just going to not name a name, but he's a friend of the program. And as soon as I start describing, he'll probably know who he is if you're listening. But a friend of ours in the internet world has been taking to Twitter lately saying some very good and I think useful things about if we're going to adopt the logic of privilege and of divesting ourselves of privilege, then ought we not to look at our Christian privilege from the standpoint of gospel privilege? We have the gospel. We have what no one else in the world has. Ought we not? Are we not morally obligated to bring that to the rest of the world? So is that an area there where the language of privilege is helpful? Now, you look at Romans chapter 1. Paul does make a very similar point. He says, I owe the gospel to everyone, right? And there is a sense in which if we own the gospel, we all owe the gospel. But even in that case, would you say that trying to make a preaching point using the word privilege because it's in the water, in the air right now. Is that helpful or not? Because the other thing is privilege is not necessarily considered a good thing or something that you want to give the underclass, because once the underclass has that, then you just have a new hegemony.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. So this is a great illustration of what pastors should not do. And I'll tell you why. Because first of all, I actually don't know who that is, but he's misunderstanding what critical theorists mean when they use that term. So,
and let me just be clear. Yeah. I'm not saying this guy is like a critical theorist or anything. Yeah, no, like that. I think he's just making some good points.
For those very reasons, I think it's a great use. So anyway, just
because here's the thing. So here's the thing So if a critical theorist heard that, they'd be like, he literally has not heard anything we're saying, because to them, privilege produced by oppression. It's not a thing it's not a neutral thing. It comes out of a system that's oppressive. The reason there are privileged people is because there are marginalized people. So their whole goal is not to.
So in other words, privilege is not blessing. See, we have a category for privilege as blessing.
Yes,
you would say
they're not using it that way. They're using it that privilege exists because people are marginalized. They're classing people as either privilege, meaning the synonym for dominant or oppressor, and the other class of people is disadvantaged, subordinate, subaltern. That's the post-colonial term, or oppressed. So the fact that you cannot have privilege without
oppression,
it's the other half of the coin, the yin and the yang. So to co-opt that term and try to know what you said is exactly true. Why doesn't he just say what Paul says? Paul says in Romans 1, I have a debt to all people, both Jew and Gentile. I owe them the gospel. Why not just say that instead of using a wrong term that critical theorists would hear that and say, you don't understand anything we're saying. And then the application would be wrong, because their application would be not to extend privilege to the underprivileged, but to destroy your own privilege by destroying the gospel. Their solution would be dismantle the system of oppression that gives you privilege, which would be Christian hegemony.
And Scott and I are both smiling because it's funny. So Scott and I are obviously coming at some of this from different perspectives. And I don't have a problem with those tweets. I think that they're clever for what they're trying to do, which is instill that point that you owe the gospel to the people around you because you have it. I do think this is just an interesting vignette, because you can see that using some of the language, some of the logic can get you somewhere within the Christian context of understanding. But as soon as you broadcast that to the world, you're at the very least possibly inviting misunderstanding. At the very least, because we're all chuckling about it. It'd be sort of like if I were to... Oh, go ahead, Scott.
That's where context matters, right? So his audience was Christians that knew exactly what he meant and knew that he was using it as a hook. It's like John Piper using Christian hedonism. You go, what? Oh, that's what he means. And I wouldn't have listened to it otherwise because he shocked me first. Like it's a rhetorical device. It's not a 1 + 1 = 2. It's like an art form, going
Are you
like,
saying
how do I
it's
get
2
your
+ 2 = 5, Scott?
I am not. You know what I mean? Like, he's using the language as language is used, to build analogies, to get people's attention, sometimes even to shock you through an unlikely use of a phrase, that makes you go, what does that mean? If he's speaking to a conference of critical theorists, then of course it makes no sense. He's going to get confusion. But to his audience, which is people who forget about missions but love Jesus and need to be reminded sometimes of the fact that, like, oh man, I've got a debt. Like, I've got to think about this. It was very effective. I know we probably won't agree on that. I just want to bring that out.
So let me give you an example. So I think I'd like to show you. So I will. And Scott, if you go to my website, when I give these talks, I don't name names. If you look at my book reviews, when I review people's books, it's their books. So I say who they are and I critique the books. So I'm not hiding it. I'm just saying when I talk about the ideas, one of the problems is if you name names, people will be like, oh, here are the bad apples. I'm like, no. The ideas are bad. And so if we don't get rid of the ideas by picking out the following people, we get rid of the ideas because it goes way beyond some set of people. The ideas themselves need to be rejected and identified first. So that's part of the reason that if I just limit it to some set of people, I wouldn't be. And first of all, some of them are, I think, well-intentioned and well-meaning, and others maybe not. But the point is, it's not about people. It's about these wrong ideas we have to reject. And you have to get underneath the people espousing them and attacking the ideas themselves. But he may give you, how does this actually play out? So I'm going to quote from Seacrest's book, Can White People Be Saved? It's an anthology of essays coming out of Fuller Seminary, which is ostensibly evangelical.
And is also the epicenter of current missiological thought.
Yes.
And he's using white to mean what?
Well, we'll get into that.
Okay.
We don't have to. I pulled out quotes from missiology because that was your relevant area, but it's also published by InterVarsity Press, so an overtly evangelical publishing company. So we're not talking about non-evangelicals here. We're talking about evangelicals, and in their book they say we are drawing on the cutting edge work of critical theorists. So you can't say, well, who knows where they're getting this from? They're getting this from critical theorists by their own admission. So here are some of the statements they make in that book. So we can talk about how they redefine white in that book. But I'm talking more about mission. So here's an example in the essay Decolonizing Salvation. The author, I think it's Andrea Smith. I could be wrong, but Smith. They write, what we presume to be true of the Bible is primarily the result of the history of European interpretation as translated into European languages. But just think about it. What we presume to be true of the Bible is primarily the result of European translation interpretation. We would have that's her word, we would have a completely different understanding of the Bible if we read it through indigenous languages translated directly from Greek and Hebrew. Now, wait a minute. Did we not currently translate the Bible directly from maybe I missed something in my, admittedly non-existent understanding of seminary education, right? But we would a totally different understanding. Like we would think it's the same as like the Buddhist texts or like the Vedas, or that's what you said. And here's another one. According to the European positivist grammar of truth, if proposition P is true, then not P must be false. Indigenous epistemologies are not beholden to such logic systems. Beliefs, even systems of belief that seem contradictory to European and Euro-American culture, for example, Christianity and indigenous religions, can coexist in indigenous culture. She just said, we think you can't be both a Christian and, say, an animist, right? But because they're logically contradictory. Now, she's not just saying, actually, you can actually fit them together. She's saying something totally different. She's saying that's your European logic, because within indigenous culture, P and not P can both be true. Alex, you just joked about 2 + 2 = 4 or equals 5, right? You just joked. Here we have an author writing that, even more radical, that P and not P can both be true at the same time, and applying it to literally Christianity and non-Christian religions, and saying they can both be true at the same time in the same way.
Well, and I think that we on this show would agree, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, but we would agree, contextualization good. If I'm on the used car lot and you show me a car and it's contextualization, I want to get in it, I want to drive it, but one of the first questions that I want to ask about this vehicle called contextualization is, where are the brakes? I just want to make sure that there's brakes in it. And what you're reading there is an example of contextualization with the brakes that are completely out. And what we do want to do is make the gospel make sense in another context. What we don't want to do is assume that everything that we are bringing into the equation is our own baggage, including even the way that we view simple propositions and things like that. Now, one thing that we brought up here is, what do the authors mean by the term white? Can white people be saved? Triangulating race, theology, and mission, InterVarsity Press. Is white there just being used as shorthand for not ethnically Caucasian people per se, but as shorthand for this sort of a construct of an oppressive hegemony? And maybe that's a question, but the one thing that I would throw in to that conversation, to that mix, is if we're using it that way to refer to that social construct, the problem is can you imagine if you were to label the black social construct in the other way?
Well, it was. I mean, that is the argument.
Right, and that would be overtly racist.
Really
and it would be the same thing. It would be overtly racist. Can black people? Well, of course, right. If we're going to say that race is a social construct, which it is, right, because we all come from Adam. So if it is a social construct, why do we want to, in one category say it's just a social construct and we're all made in the image of God, and in the other category say, well, if you're an oppressor, then it's a construct, but for you, it's an inescapable construct that you really have to deal with.
So in the book, they redefine, and this is very common among critical theorists, and frankly, I think it derives a lot from postmodern scholars too, but they redefine a lot of words because language is very important to them. Ironically, they want to recapture the language and apply it to their own ideological purposes. So they have taken words like whiteness, racism, white supremacy, and they've redefined them often in ways that will promote or anti-racism, and they want to promote their ideology by smuggling it into these terms. So in this book, I think it's in Jennings' essay, they say, when you say white people, we don't mean people with white skin, because of course, white people in that sense can be saved like everybody else can. So, okay, well then why did you ask that question? I guess you're being provocative, edgy, whatever. They say, well, what we define white people, we're actually interested in is the global whiteness project. Can that be saved? And you're like, now wait a minute here. You're defining the phrase white people to mean the global whiteness project? And how do you define a whiteness project? Well, whiteness is a way of being in the world. According to Jennings, it's a deformed building project. And you're like, at this point, you're like, I'm so confused. In what universe does English grammar work that way? Like, for example, if I said, I'm going to define bigot. Bigot is going to mean a female hockey player. Okay, guys, I'm just defining it very clearly. Think bigot. When you hear bigot, think female hockey player. And now I go give a talk to a bunch of female hockey players and I say, you're all bigots. I mean, by definition, bigots. You're a bigot, you're a bigot. Now, I say, oh, you're getting offended? Why would you be offended? I define my terms carefully, right? The answer is what you're doing is you're actually using a term as an emotional lever to gain, leverage and cudgel them into a way of thinking. And that's manipulative.
Well, but yeah. I mean, in fairness to Willie Jennings, since he's not here to defend himself, if you read The Christian Imagination, he makes a great case. I think he makes a great case of like how the term white was developed, and maybe you could argue with his historicity. I don't know. I'm not the level of historian to kind of come after that, but he ties it to Jose de Acosta, who was the first one to use the term white to basically say, here is a group of people that can oppress this people. The white people can enslave those people because we're white. And there was a whole system that was built about how to be white, who can be white, how do you get from a dark to a white. So in that sense,
Scott, that was a very white thing of you to do, by the way, knocking into your microphone like that.
And then say, "Oh," I'm just saying, like, this is where, like, I do think we need to be careful with how rigid we want to hold the definitions, because I think he's making the case that if we get back to the original use of the term white, the first time that at least he could find the term white being used of a racial people was in this white global construct to basically enslave other people and to establish ruling classes and those could be enslaved. I mean, I don't know, maybe you want to push back against that.
Well, so the question
that's his argument.
Yeah, but the question I always have is, and this happens all the time in critical race theory especially, is that they will take historical things that happened in the past, and then they'll just transport them into the present as nothing has changed. And they do the reason they actually believe that. But forget that for a second. My point is that language changes, and our communication should be such that we try to communicate as clearly as possible to the hearer. Now, and so you might say, I think he's actually right. The way that whiteness as a social construct was actually built is to establish a racial hierarchy. I actually agree with him. And you can go back to Supreme Court decisions that show how whiteness was constructed. The critical race theorists do that, I think, pretty well. However, that's not how language works. You can't take an archaic definition or archaic understanding and assume that your hearers today will adopt the same meaning and connotations. For example, I could go back and show you how females or female gender was thought to be deformed male. It was actually considered to be, females considered to be malformed males. But you would never assume that someone using, that I'm going to define the word woman today. When I call someone a woman, you're calling them inferior. You're scratching your head and thinking, no, I'm not. I'm saying that they're just a woman. You're like, no, look at the history. You say, well, that's not how people understand the word today. Or the same thing is true of you look at it's a very common practice within critical theory to go to the past, latch on to the way some term or idea developed 100, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, and then act as if nothing has changed. But again, culturally, we know that's just not the case. And at the very least, you have to understand that your hearers, when they hear you say white people cannot be saved, is that their fault that they hear you making a racist statement? No, it's actually your fault as the communicator, because you should have known how the pyramid is being used today.
I would guess they're probably using the same way that we've talked about a lot of. I mean, it was designed to be what? you know what I mean? It was designed that way to do that very thing.
But I think people, yeah.
No, well, what I think it is important that we certainly don't want to drag terms and thinking, kicking, screaming out of the past and read that upon the present day assumptions of everybody who's ethnically Caucasian, whatever that means, because that's an incredibly broad category. But in any part of this, what I don't think we want to do is take something that's true in a context, but turn that into our ism, right? The second that you put ism at the end of it, you absolutize it. You make an idol out of it. Race. Does it matter in some areas? Sure. But you add ism to it, and racism, you've immediately gone off the rails. In much the same way, did Marx say one or two things that were true? Well, sure, right? A blind squirrel finds a nut. And yet, we put ism at the end of that. We say, we're going to take this system, we're going to absolutize it. We're going to make that the God of the system, that's an error as well. And I think one thing that's important for us as believers, whether we find insights from one system or another, is to be really careful about adding the ism to the end of it. The second that we add the ism, we absolutize it, we make that the God of the system, whereas we need to be in the scriptures. And I believe 100% in the importance of history. I think there's valid inferences that we can make from sociology and from things of that nature. And modern missiology does a lot of borrowing from those disciplines. But at the same time, we need to be people of the book. We look at 2 Timothy chapter 3. Not only does Paul tell Timothy that all of Scripture is theopneustos, that it's inspired, that it's God-breathed, he also tells him that it's all useful, it's all profitable. Why? So that the man of God may be equipped for every good work. And I think what's important for us to realize is that whatever insights may or may not be able to be had out there in the realm of common grace, and certainly Scripture doesn't tell us how to pump up a flat tire or balance our checkbook, but as far as what the gospel minister is called to do, or the cross-cultural missionary is called to do. And the cross-cultural missionary is called to do lots of things. You may need to learn some survival skills. You certainly need some language acquisition skills. There's lots of things that the cross-cultural missionary needs to do that you don't necessarily get from the text of Scripture. But what is the ministry calling? What is the calling of the gospel? The Scripture is the sole and infallible rule of faith and practice for those things. Scripture is sufficient for the man of God to be equipped for every good work, every spiritual work, every act of kingdom activity that God would call the man of God to. And conversations like this, for those of you that are listening, perhaps you're leaning more towards one side, perhaps you're leaning more towards the other. I'm not going to pretend that I don't have a side. I think we all have opinions on these various things. But what is important is for all of us as Christians united in Christ, going back to the text and drawing our positions from the text. And I think that's a critically important thing. Thoughts from both of you guys?
Yeah, I just see the danger that, and I think, I don't know, Scott, would you agree at least that I've followed some conservative evangelicals, and I've been watching them just, again, drift theologically into some real, like you can see in this book, for example, these are not orthodox positions they're holding, not remotely. And I would be just super naive to not see how critical theory has produced this. It's not like they on their own came up with the idea that you can believe P and not P, and that to believe P and not P are, in contradiction. That's a European epistemology. They didn't get that from reading the Bible. They got that from reading Foucault. So I just see that happening so much today that I don't think we can turn a blind eye to it and pretend it's all just neutral. It's happening everywhere. And I can pull out some more quotes from this book, but they're really alarming. The book was, I don't think anyone who read that book could come away thinking this is harmless or we have this under control. We don't have this under control at all. It's eating us alive. And I try to be very clear. I'm not opposed to saying things like we need to examine our cultural assumptions. We need to look out for how our imagination has been shaped by racism.
We need to care about the oppressed because there's real oppression in the world.
Amen. I will say amen a gazillion times to those things. And I do in my talks. But so I am totally willing in my talks. I denounce racism. I talk about, again, I've gotten a lot of flack from people who how dare you say anything positive about critical theory at all? You have gotten flack from that side. That. And I can't lie. You want me to not say the truth? I mean, I want to acknowledge it. And frankly, like you said, there are plenty. Look at the history of missions. There have been tons of places where missions was entangled with actual colonialism, with actual slavery. And we can admit that. And we can say today, how are we going into these cultures and looking down on other people for unbiblical reasons and wicked reasons because of our sin? Yeah. All of that's fine. Yeah. What I'm saying is at the same time, we can preach all of those things that are totally true and biblical, but we need to also preach that this is a deeply false religion, basically. It is a functional religion, and also warn people it's not just abstract, that real people in real seminaries and in our culture and in real churches are drinking this poison down.
Yeah. And so I guess for me, my concerns are one that, that is happening, that there is real danger out there. And there's always been this undercurrent of liberalism within Christianity that does espouse these things. And, frankly, Fuller has been kind of down that road for a while. And yet I also reject the fundamentalist aspect on the other side that looks for, that starts to look, it's like a Red Scare, all over again. And I grew up with that. So I'm very sensitive to guys that to going, oh, you use this word and this word goes back to this thing. So clearly you meant that without finding out whether they meant that or not, and I think that's a real danger too, because Christians are just taking pot shots at other believers who aren't holding this far left view at all. They're just pointing out errors that they're seeing, because we also have this real problem in America and in the Christian church and in large denominations, even ones that I'm a part of, that go we've allowed racism to grow in America, and we've coddled it within Christianity. We've called some things heresy and other things that should be called heresy. We just said that's just culture, And so I think I guess I'm pushing to say, on one side with Alex, and I know with you, we have to be very careful of this neocolonialism thinking, and that we don't lose our evangelistic impulse, because even if the whole world says it's evil and terrible, Christ calls us to do it, and we're going to obey him. But on the other hand, also, we don't need to be, picking up stones and looking for heretics everywhere, even amongst, guys that we should know, and we hear their doctrine, we hear their gospel, we watch their way of life. And too many of our brothers have gotten stoned for things that maybe they didn't use the word the way you wanted them to. And you're not doing that. I'm not at all saying you're doing that, but there's a lot of guys that's happened to. So we just want to be careful, because I do think sometimes that pushes weak Christians, especially students, right out the door. And I think we need to be careful of that.
One of my talks, I say that I say always ask questions, ask for clarification. When you hear these words, I think you say, if you hear the phrase social justice, do not assume they're using it in this way. Just do not. If you hear the phrase white privilege, don't assume they're saying something evil. Yeah. I'd say ask.
And that's Christian love. 1 Corinthians 13 requires that.
Well, and Proverbs is full of ask questions. This one who states this case first seems right until another comes and asks questions him. So always give the benefit of the doubt, ask questions, don't jump to conclusions. And like you said, Scott, what I see is this polarizing effect where these, the people on the far right side attacking everything under the sky as Marxism actually drive, the hip evangelical Christians. They push it into the woke camp, right? This is the counter to the camp, and I'm going to go as far left as I can. So
I get these messages every week. And trying to talk young believers off the ledge, right? No, come back here. Let's talk about this.
So, but that's why when I tell, so on the one hand, I tell the people that are inclining towards the anti-woke side, I say, you have to be charitable. You have to ask questions, clarify. And again, even if it's Christian charity, number one, but number two, just pragmatically, you're actually doing more against your own cause than anybody on the left side, because you're pushing people away from your position. On the other side, though, I say, again, the number one thing I'd say is just drop the jargon. Everything that we said tonight that involved anything that sounded remotely like critical theory, we could say by literally quoting scripture, right? Like, you don't have to use any of those terms. And so if I'm saying to this side, ask questions, don't jump to conclusions as an act of Christian charity, then look, the woke-ish side should, out of an act of Christian charity, don't provoke your brothers, right? Don't use those terms that are going to be triggering, ironically, to the anti-woke side. Rephrase it in a biblical way, and you're sure you're going to get some people that just are unappeasable. But other people will be, okay, all he's saying is let's not make everybody wear khakis to church. I mean, you don't have, I actually, on one podcast, I said,
Scott, do you want to stand up and show us everything?
I'm wearing cargo shorts right now. So I'm preaching to the choir here.
Well, for those of our listeners who've sojourned with us,
if you're still listening, your reward is that
I'm wearing a dress shirt, but I've got athletic pants. So actually, I've got gym shorts on because it's 10 p.m. here on the East Coast. And maybe that is a great point to end on. Neil, how can people find you?
If you Google Neil Shenvi, NeilShenvi, you can find my website. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm trying to be less active because my kids are back in school, but my handle is at Neil Shenvi, NeilShenvi. And my collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, is a good one to follow too. He's a real Pat Sawyer on Twitter. I just want to close by saying I do think the problem in the church is polarization. We're following the culture and becoming polarized. And I think we need to really foster healthy dialogue that is both willing to take a hard look at our praxis, our imagination, our theology, and ask, is it biblical, right? And not to shy away from those questions. And on the other hand, is also willing to say, this way of thinking that's so popular in our culture right now is anti-biblical, and we cannot accept it. We can ask both of those questions at the same time and be aware of both dangers.
And that's another reason we need to be in our Bibles, because if we're in the text of Scripture, we're going to have 1 Corinthians 13 reminding us that love believes all things about our brothers in the Lord. We're also going to be in books like Jude that warns us of false teaching in scathing terms. And we need both of these to form our Christian character, our habits, the way that we engage online, and not just online. It should affect our immediate lives. And if we're more focused on debates out there in cyberspace and not actually what we have moral proximity to as far as responsibility or sphere of influence, that's an important thing as well. So, Neil, really appreciate the dialogue here, or trialogue maybe at this point with the three of us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. Scott. Yeah.